This is our presentation on medieval music. We're going to start by looking at Gregorian chant. We call Gregorian chant by that name because Pope Gregory is given credit for starting to catalog the music of that time. It represents thousands of monophonic songs, or you can call them chants, for the Mass and the office. So the Mass is the weekly celebration of the resurrection of Christ, celebrated on Sundays, and the office is the daily sequence of prayers that nuns and monks would have sung every day of the year. As I said, Pope Gregory the First is sort of credited with organizing and cataloging the repertoire of religious chants. However, it's unlikely that he really did this all himself. It's a little bit of spin, perhaps, to say that one person did this. At the time that Pope Gregory lived, there were at least 6 different regional styles of chant, and he began the process of bringing them together and organizing them. Ironically, it's called Gregorian chant, but notation actually began when Charlemagne, about 2 centuries later, began to notate and catalog the chants that he knew of. Now, it's interesting because he tried to send people to Rome to get what would be authentic Roman chants, but the interaction didn't go as smoothly as planned, and in the end, the form of chant that is most well preserved from Charlemagne's attempt is actually the Carolingian style of chant. One way around the complexities of really knowing which kind of chant you're talking about is just to use the term plain chant. So that would mean a monophonic chant without metered rhythm used in a Catholic service. The reason that chant was used, there are probably 2 main reasons. One is that it would make the words easier to hear in a large booming cathedral. The sung words would carry better. And the other reason is that singing helps elevate expression. So instead of performing this service in everyday speech, if a priest is chanting the words, it will help to create a more spiritual experience. In terms of the idea of continuity and transformation, we can also see that chant probably follows from the Hebrew tradition. And the early Christians were borrowing freely from Greek, Roman, Hebrew traditions, and chant was no doubt one of those things. We're going to listen to an example of chant, and you will hear that there's more than one person singing, but it's still called monophonic because there is only one melody being sung. We'll move on to Hildegard of Bingen. She's profiled in the textbook. Hildegard was born in 1098 to a noble family But she was pledged from birth to the church, so she knew her whole life that she would live in an abbey as a nun. She became a prioress at a convent and then eventually founded her own convent. She had a very active intellectual and spiritual life and was quite unconventional. She traveled around Europe preaching, and that was really not something that women were allowed to do, but she did it anyway. Similarly, her nuns, her convent operated unconventionally. The women did not wear the plain clothes. They could wear jewelry. They could wear colors. Hildegard wrote lyric poetry. So she wrote nearly 80 Latin songs, mostly about Mary. And her work is largely sacred, but it's not part of the Mass proper. So she had poetic freedom as she was writing about her subject, which is primarily Mary. The example that we'll listen to is from the Symphony of the Harmony of the Heavenly Revelations. So this is a collection of something like 77 pieces that she put together of her own poetry on sacred subjects. And the words are very passionate and emotional. It's religious music, but it's very deeply felt. So on the next slide, we'll have a translation, and we will listen to some of the music. It's probably a good time to mention that I will have the music posted separately on D2L so that you can listen again or listen to the whole thing. Or when you want to refer to just the piece, you will be able to get to it without listening to the whole presentation. So we'll move on to polyphony. Now you'll have noticed in the previous examples there was more than one person singing, but it was monophonic because it was a single melody. Polyphony literally means many sounds, and it means there's more than one voice. So the earliest written example comes from around 850, and this early polyphony is called organum. Became gradually more complex over the centuries. The basic idea of organum is that it adds a higher, faster moving voice to an already existing plain chant. So at Notre Dame in Paris, Léonin composed, or compiled, we're not sure that he wrote all of it, but he compiled two-voice organum into the Magnus Liber Organi. And after him, Perrotin, working in the same Notre Dame Cathedral, started writing up to 4 voices in organum. And this is called the Notre Dame style of organum, and their work was cataloged and preserved. It comes down to us. So unlike the Greek and Roman eras where the music is largely conjecture, at this point we have a good idea of how the music would have sounded. There are still some questions, but we'll listen to an example of a 2-voice organum here in the Notre Dame style, and you'll hear the lowest voice moving very, very slowly, very long note values, and the higher voice moves more quickly. We're going to move on to the motet. The motet was the most important polyphonic genre in 14th century England. It was also very important in other European countries. The basic idea of a motet is that instead of just two melodies, it's two melodies and two texts, and then sometimes more than that. Not only can the texts be two separate texts, but they can actually be in separate languages. And the item here, mathematical forms, refers to the fact that these two texts and their melodies and rhythms would be set in certain proportions to one another, so that there would be an overarching scheme, not just meter like we think of, where one measure might be counted in 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, but actually a mathematical equation that covers the whole piece, so that one melody might be 2 times as long as one of the other melodies, and then another melody would be 3 times as long, so the whole thing would be set up in proportions derived from the number 6. So it's very complicated, but it's important to realize that there was something other than personal expression at work. It was a very academic and scholastic undertaking to write one of these motets. The example I have here, it starts out with just one melody, and you'll hear the voices singing the same words. But at about 1 minute 10 seconds, you will hear the talea come in. That's just one of the elements of a motet. You'll hear that come in, and then from there on, it gathers in complexity with additional voices being added. We won't listen to the whole thing during this presentation, but it will be available online. A little bit about the Ars Nova. It's a new direction in music. Philippe de Vitry helped to create a more flexible system of notation that allowed much more variety in the rhythmic figures that were notated, as well as the pitches and melodic forms. It's really the first time in the history of Western Europe since the fall of Rome where secular music has the upper hand in terms of forward development. The church required that the chant remain clear, simple, easy to understand. They didn't want the character of the chant to be changed, And so this newfound complexity and rhythmic intricacy found expression in secular music. It's not to say that it wasn't used in sacred as well. It certainly was. Guillaume de Machaut wrote both secular and sacred music. When he was writing secular music, he very often was writing his or setting his own poetry to music. And his music sounds non-academic. It sounds expressive. It's very smooth and peaceful sounding, except for moments of very intentional dissonance. And remember, dissonance creates tension in music, and then when the dissonance goes away, that creates a sense of resolution. So especially for words, if, for example, if Machaut was writing a motet about the crucifixion or the Day of Judgment, he could use dissonance to underline a painful word. So here we have an example by Machaut. This, you'll hear that smoothness until about 56 seconds in. Then there's a real dissonance, grating notes that grate against each other, which resolves after just a few seconds at about 1:01. You'll also be able to hear at about that same resolution that feeling of cadence. So instead of being one continuous thing, there's a very clear point of rest at the cadence. So you heard dissonance right before the cadence, which is actually still common in our music. So we really hear the development. If you think back to the very first example I played for you, that was a Kyrie. And what we just heard by Machaut is also a Kyrie. So music has been very much transformed within the centuries that we've talked about. We'll play a little bit of English polyphony for you. There also the notation was allowing more specific rhythms, and you'll hear a little bit more elaborate feel in this English example, and also consonant harmonies. So in our Western tradition, our intervals can be pure, as in perfect fourth, fifth, and octave, or they can be major or minor, which is what we think of as consonant. In our modern music, we base most of our harmonies on major or minor tonality. And the music, all the examples we've heard so far in this presentation have been based on perfect intervals, perfect fourths and fifths. It's part of what makes it sound like old church music. Well, listen to this English example, and I think you'll hear that the harmonies are more familiar because they were comfortable much earlier than the rest of Europe using thirds. Here's a beautiful example of a conductus. So this kind of music was probably written for the church, but it was not liturgical. In other words, it was not part of the Mass proper, but would have been most likely used to be sung while the lectionary was carried from its place out to from which it was to be read. So this is just a very beautiful example. And we'll end that there. The last type of music that we'll look at is that of the troubadours. So this is from the later Middle Ages, 11th to 13th centuries. And these were poet musicians who would sing of courtly love in what was truly a secular tradition. And the example I have here is from Bernard de Ventadorn, and it's very expressive of the despair of these lyrics. I will play one verse for you here and leave the song posted on D2L if you would like to listen to more.
And when I love it home, desde contra insolidas las e la stanzorca divine. Ai, tan gran sembreamen de che la jalousia meraviglia sei perdesse lo cor de désiré non fort.